Meet the Zeekr 9X. It comes with a $70,000 price tag, and from the outside it gives off some serious Rolls-Royce Cullinan vibes. Now, the Cullinan is one of the most ultra-luxurious vehicles on the planet, starting at an eye-watering $450,000. But this Chinese contender, its fully loaded top-tier model maxes out at just 70 grand in China. Even if you slapped a 100% tariff on it, you're still looking at less than $150,000. But here's the kicker. It doesn't just look the part. It delivers 95% of the luxury and comfort of a Rolls-Royce while absolutely blowing it out of the water when it comes to smart tech. It's pretty mind-blowing. Chinese automakers have pushed the price to performance ratio to the absolute limit. To even survive in the Chinese market right now, foreign brands are being forced into massive price cuts. And even then, giants like Porsche have seen their Chinese market share plummet by 60%. Nissan actually had to sell off its headquarters just to keep the cash flowing. The Chinese auto industry is ruthlessly wiping out any competitor that refuses to adapt. But if you rewind the clock 20 years, nobody would have believed China could become an automotive powerhouse, let alone outpace the US in the race that followed. So how exactly did they pull this off? 2 decades ago, China was on the verge of becoming the world's largest oil importer. This massive addiction to gasoline forced the government to seriously think about going electric. On top of that, this newly minted industrial powerhouse desperately needed a massive future-proof industry to act as the ultimate engine for its economic growth. Cars were the perfect candidate, but there was a catch. Traditional internal combustion engine (ICE) vehicles rely on 3 critical components: the engine, the chassis, and the transmission. And the technological barriers to entry here were impossibly high. Japan and the West had almost a century of a head start in R&D. The Chinese knew they'd probably never catch up, and frankly, they were right. So instead of playing a losing game, they decided to change the game entirely. They pivoted to electric vehicles. In 2009, the Chinese government officially designated EVs as a national strategic industry. And that's when they started carefully nurturing this absolute monster of a market. At its core, an EV is basically just a giant battery on wheels with a shell around it. In fact, even today, the battery alone eats up about 40% of a vehicle's total manufacturing cost. The logic was simple. If they could manufacture cars the same way they churn out iPhones, the sheer economies of scale would force production costs to plummet. But they were starting from scratch. That meant a massive learning curve, constant failures, and tons of companies inevitably going bankrupt before ever seeing a dime of profit. And the biggest hurdle of all, China didn't even have a domestic EV market yet. So, to keep these startups alive, the government stepped in with massive guaranteed orders. They rolled out over 10,000 fully electric buses and taxis across 10 major cities, essentially using public transit to artificially engineer that first wave of demand. Fast forward to 2013, and to really kick things into high gear, the government rolled out subsidies that were, quite frankly, borderline absurd. The cash they handed out for every EV rolling off the assembly line sometimes actually exceeded the cost to build the car itself. Take an electric bus, for example. If you combined the central and local government payouts, the total subsidy could be up to 3 times the actual manufacturing cost. A company could slap together a poorly built electric bus for just $20,000 and pocket a cool $60,000 in government money. In other words, all they had to do was build a vehicle, slap a license plate on it, and even if it never actually sold to a real customer, they were still walking away with massive, effortless profits. Overnight, hundreds of EV startups exploded onto the scene in China. Some of these companies didn't even have a physical office. They were literally building cars out of PowerPoint presentations, pitching investors to fund tiny workshops, slapping together completely unusable garbage using the absolute cheapest tech available, and then selling those cars to dummy corporations they had set up themselves. Ultimately, these pieces of industrial trash, built solely to milk government subsidies, were just dumped on the outskirts of cities, creating massive, dystopian car graveyards. It wasn't until the Chinese government stepped in with brutal crackdowns that this Wild West behavior was finally brought to a halt. But that was just the chaotic early days. Despite paying a massive financial price, the Chinese government doubled down, rolling out a slew of new policies. To force improvements in battery tech, they introduced ruthless new standards. Automakers could only get their hands on those sweet subsidy checks if their vehicles used batteries that met strict performance metrics. On top of that, they designed a completely new type of license plate exclusively for EVs. Now, because of brutal traffic congestion and pollution, all major Chinese cities had incredibly strict restrictions on traditional gas-powered cars at the time. Everyday people had to shell out an extra $10,000 just to get a gas car license plate. And even then, you could only drive your gas car 3 or 4 days a week. The rest of the time, it was legally banned from the roads. But if you bought an EV, you could completely bypass all of that. Sure, the green EV license plates were arguably ugly as sin, but buyers didn't have to pay a dime for them. You could drive wherever and whenever you wanted, and in some places, you even got free parking. These perks artificially created a tidal wave of consumer demand that completely dwarfed the original government procurement projects. And to sweeten the deal even further, the government handed out irresistible financial incentives to the public. Every single person who bought an EV could pocket an $8,000 cash subsidy. In mega cities like Shanghai and Beijing, that number could hit a staggering $16,000. Demand skyrocketed. Hundreds of automakers found themselves in a sweet spot where they could sell absolutely uncompetitive EVs. As long as they bought compliant batteries and did some basic assembly, the subsidy checks kept rolling in. And with the government picking up the tab, consumers were perfectly happy to buy these cheap little commuter cars. But an environment like this was never going to breed a truly competitive industry. If the policy faucet suddenly turned off, over 90% of these companies would go belly up overnight. However, these policies did unintentionally trigger a massive boom in another crucial piece of infrastructure: public charging stations. Today, China boasts 29 million charging points, providing the ultimate lifeblood for 40 million EVs. To force real competition into the mix, the government started cranking up the requirements for battery energy density. The higher the energy density, the bigger the subsidy check. If your battery didn't make the cut, you got nothing. This carrot and stick approach forced domestic companies to pour insane amounts of cash into R&D, desperately trying to develop ternary lithium batteries that could pack a much bigger punch. Within a few years, BYD and CATL cracked the code on core battery technology, bumping EV range from a meager 200 kilometers to over 600 kilometers. Then came the ultimate plot twist. The Chinese government threw the doors wide open and welcomed Tesla. In 2019, the Shanghai government practically handed Tesla 9 million square feet of land for its gigafactory at a mere tenth of the market price. At the time, Elon Musk's company was desperately strapped for cash and dangerously close to bankruptcy. Yet, China's largest bank swooped in with roughly $1.5 billion in low-interest loans. It took just 11 months from Tesla setting foot in China to rolling its first car off the assembly line. The government extended every single perk it gave domestic companies to Tesla, but there was one non-negotiable catch. Within a few years, Tesla had to fully localize its entire supply chain. To hold up its end of the bargain, Tesla aggressively forced its strict international standards onto Chinese parts suppliers. They even dispatched their own engineers to help these local vendors level up their tech. The result? Manufacturing a Tesla in China costs just a third of what it did back in the US. Complacent Chinese automakers suddenly found themselves utterly outmatched by this absolute juggernaut. A top-tier Tesla wasn't much more expensive than the low-quality toys domestic brands were putting out. And then Tesla dropped the hammer, slashing the prices of its two most popular models by 6% and 13%. With that kind of pressure, it took just a few months for China's EV bubble to burst. Domestic companies were forced to dump most of their capital into R&D and aggressively trim the fat. Within a few years, 80% of local automakers went belly up. The survivors were hanging by a thread, kept on life support purely by investor funding. To make matters worse, the Chinese government slashed the remaining EV subsidies by 50% and restricted them to cars priced under $40,000. Tesla, sitting at $50,000 at the time, had no choice but to cut prices to qualify. To protect its margins, Tesla leaned even harder into local components, doubling down on training and upgrading the domestic supply chain. By 2022, when the subsidies were completely phased out, Tesla had already built a highly mature automotive supply chain right inside China. In Shanghai, every single high-standard component needed for an EV could be sourced within a 4-hour radius. These top-tier suppliers, trained and whipped into shape by Tesla, were now serving Chinese automakers too, giving the entire domestic industry a rock-solid foundation. It was only at this point that China's EV industry truly became battle-ready, and that's exactly why, starting around 2022, you suddenly started seeing Chinese EVs popping up on roads all over the world. Without China, the Tesla we know today wouldn't exist. But without Tesla, China's EV empire wouldn't exist either. The automakers that survived Tesla's brutal trial by fire started to thrive, riding the wave of a hyper-efficient supply chain and a rock-solid tech foundation. Backed into a corner by government policies, Chinese companies were forced to pivot from simply assembling cars to actually innovating. Traditionally, developing a new gas-powered car takes about 3 to 5 years. Chinese EV makers? They've slashed that iteration cycle down to under 18 months. Meanwhile, BYD and CATL achieved massive breakthroughs in battery tech. Today, lithium iron phosphate batteries are steadily phasing out the older ternary lithium ones, offering better safety and longer range. These giants are quietly buying up lithium mines across the globe. Right now, 70% of the world's lithium batteries are made in China. They've essentially built an impenetrable technological moat, much like the monopoly Western countries held over combustion engine tech for a century. Production is now so efficient and tech is evolving so fast that the Chinese market literally cannot consume all the cars it builds. The domestic competition is an absolute bloodbath. They're moving over 15 million EVs a year. Every brand is desperately fighting to offer better, cheaper products. If they don't, they die. It's that simple. Every company is flexing its own unique superpower. Zeekr has the ultimate chassis and motors. BYD dominates in battery tech. XPeng has an autonomous driving system that goes toe-to-toe with Tesla's FSD, and through it all, their pricing remains insanely competitive. So, what happens if these cars fully enter the US market? How would American automakers even respond? Just like that example from the beginning of the video, an ultra-luxury 6-seater SUV, even with tariffs, costs just a third of a Rolls-Royce. And in China, the options are endless. Take the XPeng GX, it outclasses a Range Rover in features, but it'll only set you back $50,000. Or the highly competitive Leapmotor D19, where $30,000 gets you the comfort and driving experience of a Porsche Cayenne or an Audi Q8. Ultimately, this massive spillover in production capacity is going to benefit low to middle income families worldwide. As long as tariffs are kept reasonable, everyday people will finally be able to afford cars that are highly affordable, yet phenomenally well built. Maybe this is what the democratization of technology actually looks like. Today, China's EV industry is an unstoppable behemoth, slashing insane brand markups for consumers while relentlessly challenging the legacy giants of the old era.
Hey guys, I'm the creator here, and my editor and I run this channel together. Thank you so much for watching this far. We are a brand new channel, and we really need subscribers right now to help us get into YPP and keep making videos. If you like what you saw, please consider subscribing. It's the biggest support you could get us. Thank you very much.